Thanks for making the move with us over here to our digital side as we discuss the state of the city tonight with Kimberly Gill. I'm Devin Skillian, and we're joined by our good friends here to help us analyze what we just heard. Nolan Fenley, editorial page editor of the Detroit News, and Stephen Henderson from Detroit Today on WDET. I think that there's always an interesting balancing act when anybody gives an address about what's going on in Detroit, where clearly pessimism never sells, but you've got to somehow balance your optimism with reality. And let's start there with how you think the mayor did with that.
Well, you know, I thought it was a speech focused at what his priority has to be, and that's the neighborhoods. You notice he never mentioned downtown development in that speech. It was all about what he's going to do to improve the quality of life of this city, and neighborhoods are the fabric of a city. Without the neighborhoods, you don't have a city, and that business about education and crime and then improving quality of life, I think, were the key elements. You know, I thought the biggest headline of that speech in my mind was the plan to improve transportation for schools, to get kids to the schools of their choice. School choice means nothing if parents can't get their kids to the schools they choose.
Yeah, the Detroit parent next to you is nodding his head. I know you. Right, that was really caught your attention.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you talk about neighborhoods in the city. You're talking about families. That's where most families live, and most of us live with inadequate services and support for the things that we need to make sure that our families work. One of the biggest ones is transportation to schools. It is really hard if you live on the east side and have a kid who goes to school on the west side. How do you get them there every day? And if you don't have a car, you're talking about hours on buses. There are stories of parents who have kids in different schools around the city riding buses for 4 or 5 hours a day trying to get them there and back. The idea of piloting a network that would pick kids up, drop them off at school, then come back, get them, take them home, or take them to a neighborhood center where there's other kinds of supports, homework help and these other things. That's a pretty revolutionary thing to be talking about in Detroit.
What are some of the other highlights, Nolan, that you saw other than this bus transportation?
Well, I mean, the additional police officers, the expansion of the green light programs and the ceasefire programs, taking programs, test programs that have worked, trying to scale them across the city. I think that was very good ideas. But the appearance stuff he talked about in terms of beautifying the neighborhoods, fixing the roads, making Detroit look better. If a city looks better, you feel better about living there. I thought that was significant.
Yeah, the job training as well. The idea that we have all these jobs that have come into the city. He talked about all the places downtown that have added jobs. Most Detroiters can't qualify for a lot of those jobs. Most Detroiters
it's a struggle. Pointing out the fact that what happened with the building of Little Caesars Arena, everybody had it in black and white in front of them. The targets, what they were, what it was going to cost the Illiches when they didn't hit them, and the reality was they didn't, knowing that was there because they couldn't.
Right, we were at half what the number promised was, but you had all these people get experience working on that project, which means they're now qualified for the next one, and the money that the Illiches were fined goes to more training. But this focus on training and on consolidating the training efforts so that they all work together, that's a huge thing as well in Detroit. We've had job training forever here. It has not worked as effectively as it can because you haven't had the city sort of managing it the way that the mayor wants.
If you're training people for actual jobs, the incentive to stay in those programs, to make those programs work.
Sorry, I'm trying to look at comments here, and I just getting our live feed going over the air.
So that's an incentive is much greater. Now, the challenge is once you get a Detroiter trained and on the job, you got to keep that person in Detroit. And I think that's why these other elements of schools, the crime, are so important, because what a lot of contractors have experienced, they hire and train a Detroiter, they get to a certain income, they're out of the city. And so you have to
and they don't qualify, they don't help you qualify anymore.
I may have missed this day at school, but I had not heard before that the Canadian government, who clearly is far more focused on getting this bridge built than anybody else is, have given $10 million to train Detroiters to help build the bridge.
That's the first time I'd heard anything like that. It's the first time I heard anything about building a bridge in a while too, if you think about it.
Well, that's right too.
We've been talking for 5 years about that bridge going up, and it hasn't happened. that's another huge piece. Like this idea of making sure that those of us, he did a great rhetorical job of talking about those who stayed, the people who didn't abandon the city, and what they need and what they're owed at this point. I thought that was the right tone, and the jobs picture of that is huge, obviously.
And here's a new wrinkle from the past. Instead of talking about ways to get Detroiters out to the jobs in the suburbs, he was talking a good deal about creating jobs here through entrepreneurship.
And making sure they have them.
You know, programs like Motor City Match, Entrepreneurs of Color, trying to make sure people have jobs where they live rather than worrying about getting them out somewhere else to work.
He didn't talk a lot about regional transportation, but do you think that's a big issue in terms of getting people to jobs and getting them to
He didn't
job
say much
training?
tonight about that, given how central that's been of the debate, right?
Yeah, I think he didn't say anything about it because it's stalled, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you have two other counties in Southeast Michigan have pretty much said they don't want to go back at it this year, so that's probably going to be a 2020 thing. But there's no question that the mayor knows that we can't continue to grow the city the way that we want to without regional transit as well.
And the reality is, if they don't come to some sort of deal within the next couple of weeks, it's too late to mount a campaign, to shape the proposal and get it passed. They're just out of time.
If he's Captain Ahab, I do think his Moby Dick has become car insurance. He did talk about that and the continuing struggles with, maybe you'd loop in potholes now with the main frustration on a daily basis of Detroiters, but car insurance is still this mammoth problem that it really hasn't been solvable.
And you know, now there's a proposal to scrap no fault altogether rather than try to fix the catastrophic care provision, just to scrap it altogether. I think they can still go back and come up with a reasonable compromise on capping those benefits and putting in a fee schedule so that this fund is a lot less costly. You don't have to get rid of the whole thing. You just have to make sure it's not being abused and it's not excessive.
Yeah,
you don't like this idea of getting rid of no fault, Stephen?
No, I mean, I think if I had a conversation with some folks who remember the tort system we had before, and they to a number say it was worse than this was. The truth is that any system you have is going to have negative aspects to it. The question is, what's the least worst choice? I actually think no fault is probably somewhere in that range. It's a question of who pays. When someone has a catastrophic accident, you don't want to cap their fees, I don't think. I think you want to talk about who's going to share the cost.
Every other state does, and they don't have the dire outcomes that people are predicting.
They do have those outcomes. They don't have them in widespread numbers, but you have lots of people who've been left to fend for themselves.
But right now, unlimited truly means unlimited. There are no reasonable caps on this thing, no reasonable limits on this. Any treatment goes. You've got lawyers and doctors in cahoots in terms of...
Which no less a conservative than Brooks Patterson, after his experience, has decided is a pretty good idea.
I think Brooks is a great example.
But it's not working. I mean, the costs are excessive. We're twice as high as the national average here. So it's not working. The average claims $50,000 a year. I mean, that is just...
But you also have the insurance companies themselves, I think, gouging and redlining in a way that helps drive those costs higher. I think any solution you come up with has to deal with those issues as well as the catastrophic cost.
Kim, as a city resident, what jumped out at you? What stayed with you tonight?
You know, I just wanted him to talk more about my taxes and lowering them.
Yeah, property taxes still out of control.
Still a big deal. You know, and crime too. I mean, he mentioned that there are 140 some odd more employees that are coming to DPD. That was good to hear, though I don't know, is that the answer? Adding more police officers?
It's probably part of the answer, right? I mean, police presence is one of the things that discourages crime in the first place, and that's sort of where we are. I mean, I think they've done a good job of trying to respond better and more quickly to crime when it happens. The question is, how much crime can you prevent? And police presence is part of that. The other things he was talking about, ceasefire, is enormously successful in other cities. That's not
sort of the way we think of classic policing, but it takes manpower to make those kind of programs go.
I think that's where these 141 officers are going. What this speech was absent, though, was a really big idea. Most of the stuff he talked
The
about.
bus thing is a pretty big
That is,
idea.
but most of it was built on things they're already doing. If he'd come out and said something, like you proposed, to get rid of the property tax altogether, and and forget about
find other ways to
punishing
raise
people
money.
for living here,
Right.
and finding other ways to raise money, encourage more people to move in, that would have been a really big idea.
Interesting. I also wanted to ask you guys both, his comment though that, let me find, where was I? About the...
Can't read your own handwriting.
Oh, about, and this takes us back to schools. Now, this was a stunning thing to me. Every morning, 32,500 Detroit kids get up and go to school somewhere else.
Right.
I think combined, that would be about the size of the 2 towns that Kimberly and I call our hometowns. I mean, 32,000 people is a good-sized town.
It would be somewhere around in the top. I would be somewhere in the top 5 of, if that was a school district.
Of a district, right?
in the
Right.
state.
There you
Number
go.
2.
Right? Is
Duggan
D
said
say
it
it
would
would
be
be the
number
second
2.
largest?
That's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, if you live here and you're raising kids, and I'm doing that,
Yep.
the choices inside the city, especially as your kids get older, they narrow, they dwindle, and if you're trying to do better, you're making choices outside the city. A lot of those are private options, obviously, but you also have these public school systems outside the city that are siphoning kids off. He showed that bus network that River Rouge has, 200 miles of bus routes through the city to pick up kids and take them to, nothing against River Rouge, but a district that's not that much better than what you see in Detroit, but they have transportation, which is the thing people want.
Sure, it's an answer.
And if I'm not mistaken, I mean, obviously he came in before we were ready, but I think Dr. Nikolai Vitti, the school superintendent, introduced him tonight, and that has to be his #1 ally in restoring the neighborhoods.
You get that sense.
He's got to be
and as
rooting for Vitti's success.
As a couple people have pointed out on the comments tonight, Vitti's only been here a year.
Yeah.
And we need to give him a chance to make some
Yeah,
traction.
but this idea of a transportation network gives him, again, what you want for Detroit public schools is a level playing field with other schools. There are charter schools that have transportation, and that's most of them don't.
Yeah.
But some of the ones that really compete can go pick up kids.
Yeah,
What you want
that's
to make
right.
sure.
Most of them parents are in the same boat as everybody else.
But what you want to do is that actually adds to the class difference between kids who go to charter schools and public schools. Often it's kids who have parents who can get them to school, who can choose charters, and they can't go, the kids who can't get there are stuck in public schools. You want to level that playing field. You want to make sure that, even as Nolan says here, that choice doesn't mean anything if everybody doesn't have the same ability to exercise that choice. And Vitti really needs that pilot to work this fall if they're going to really do that.
Last thing maybe we should talk about here is where the mayor started. He sort of famously said as he was elected, give me 6 months, and if I haven't turned around, or a year, if I haven't turned around the tide of people leaving, it's getting closer. At least it's certainly slowed a lot. But this being the first address of his second term, let's assess kind of where he is and what his marching orders are now moving forward.
Well, I don't think you can deny the progress that's being made and the momentum. But the reality is this was 60 years in the making. It's not, he's not going to be the one that sees Detroit to its brighter day. That's going to be decades in the future before we
Will
can
any
get
of us
there.
be here?
No, probably not. But that's going to be decades in the future. What his job is to continue the progress while he's here, hand it off to someone else who will continue the progress. This is a many-decade chore ahead of the city of Detroit.
Yeah. So I had an interesting conversation with somebody from out of town who this weekend was visiting, and he asked what neighborhoods he could go to see this turnaround that he's been reading about in Detroit, places that were desolate and decayed and emptied that now are starting to come back. And I had to sit and think a long time before I could come up with a neighborhood like that. We have neighborhoods that are doing well, but they were never in the worst condition of a place like that. And it made me think about the mayor and what his task is this next 4 years. I think you have to be able in the next 4 years to say Fitzgerald, right, is one of these Live 6 neighborhoods. that's starting to come back. That money that they've spent there is really starting to take hold and move things forward. Bagley, you know, places that we're starting to talk about investing in again. We want to see some successes. We've got them at the top. You know, Boston Edison, Indian Village, Palmer, and Sherwood. They're doing really well. But these other places where you've got this real isolation and just absolute devastation, he's got to make this stuff matter. And I think he's doing the right things. The question is how quickly you can dig out of those deep holes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good stuff.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
You can wrap it up.
Lots of really good comments coming in. Let me make sure that we've still I didn't want to hit miss anything obvious that people were talking about. A number of folks talking about your issue with taxes. And,
we didn't talk about
really
affordable housing. You know, there's this effort to keep, you know, enough affordable housing in the city of Detroit. One thing I didn't realize, the difference between affordable housing and low-income housing. You hear affordable housing and you're thinking that it's one thing, but it really...
He's not talking about Section 8 housing, I don't think.
No,
No.
This is housing that has been subsidized by HUD, and therefore you have to keep a certain number of units affordable.
Right.
And I think they're doing better than that than we have for a long time in Detroit, where the credits would expire and they would try to put people out, and that happened in that one building downtown.
It was one of the lines that went over really well tonight. We're not moving anybody out just so that we can move somebody in. Yeah, all right. A lot more to discuss, obviously, about this. We'll have a wrap-up from Mara McDonald coming up tonight on Local 4 News at 11. She was there in the room tonight. Thanks, guys, for being here.
Thank you for coming. Okay, we'll see you tonight at 11.